Ancient Japan, an archipelago forged by volcanic activity and isolated by oceans, stands as a land where mythology and history intertwine. Shaped by rugged terrains and its distinct geography, it fostered a unique cultural evolution, separate yet influenced by its Asian neighbors. The Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, early chronicles, recount mythological origins where gods like Izanagi and Izanami shaped the islands, and the divine sun goddess Amaterasu illuminated the heavens. This blend of creation myths and natural reverence is central to Japan's native Shinto beliefs, an animistic tradition that venerates kami, spirits embodying nature's elements. The early Japanese mirrored their landscape's resilience as waves of migration interspersed with the indigenous Jomon culture, renowned for its ancient cord-patterned pottery. By 300 BC, the Yayoi arrived, introducing iron, wet rice agriculture, and structured societies. This marked the rise of clans like Yamatai, where leaders such as the shaman queen Himiko ruled. Over time, these settlements coalesced into the Yamato state, blending domestic traditions with Chinese innovations, such as writing and Confucian philosophy, shaping a hierarchical yet culturally rich society. From the Nara to Heian periods, Japan blossomed into a realm of artistic refinement and evolving governance. Capitals like Nara and Kyoto, modeled after China's Chang'an, became hubs of Buddhist and Shinto synthesis. During Heian times, the court's artistic indulgence produced masterpieces like The Tale of Genji, reflecting fleeting beauty and the transience of life. Yet, as courtly influence waned, the rise of the samurai heralded feudal shifts, decentralizing power and fostering a warrior ethos immortalized in Bushido, the way of the warrior. Japan's tumultuous feudal era was punctuated by resilience and cultural innovation. From the Mongol invasions repelled by the kamikaze winds to the unification under leaders like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, Japan transitioned into the Tokugawa shogunate. This period of centralized feudalism balanced isolation with internal order, laying the foundation for modernity while preserving the mystique of a land where gods, warriors, and emperors have eternally coexisted. Japan is an island nation that gets its name from being close to the Asian mainland but isolated. It is separated from Korea by the Straits of Tsushima, roughly 200 kilometers away. Compared to the approximately 30 kilometers separating the UK from the European mainland, this was undoubtedly a significant obstacle to foreign contact in early Japan. Because of this isolation, local cultural practices adapted foreign ideas, and cultural borrowing from the mainland occurred at a comparatively even pace. Although there were significant changes, Japanese civilization could not have been altered by a military conquest of the mainland. The Norman invasion of the British Isles was unique. Because of its willingness to embrace foreign concepts, Japan is often seen as a borrowing nation. This is partially accurate, but Japanese culture also strongly reflects domestic traits. Japan is a sizable nation, roughly 1.5 times larger than the UK, and on par with Germany. It comprises about 7,000 smaller islands in addition to the 4 main islands of Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. These islands have varying climates and are roughly 3,000 kilometers long from north to south. While the Ryukyu Islands in the south are subtropical and stretch nearly to Taiwan, Hokkaido experiences cold winters and heavy snowfalls due to its proximity to Siberia. Japan's terrain is extremely rocky, with suitable ecological niches that support sizable populations. The largest is the Kanto Plain, where modern Tokyo is located. It is about 10 times bigger than the 2 main agriculturally productive areas, the Kansai Plain, Osaka, Kyoto, and Nara area, and the Nobi Plain, Nagoya area. Because the country was formed by volcanic eruptions, more than half of it is mountainous. The cone of Mount Fuji, which has been dormant since 1707, is, in fact, one of the most well-known representations of Japan. Its summit is approximately 3,800 meters high. Japan's interior has a significant natural barrier because the central Haida Range contains numerous peaks higher than 2,000 meters. Just 14% of the land is used for agriculture. The rest comprises fields, forests, cities, roads, and water. Japan's population is concentrated in less than 5% of its total land area, so we frequently think of it as crowded. The high degree of urbanization has been a phenomenon since the late 19th century, especially in the last 50 years, despite the media's dramatic depictions of congested urban conditions. Finally, it's critical to recognize that Japan has a sizable population. Japan is home to roughly 126 million people, making it the 7th most populous country in the world. Naturally, the topography has influenced Japan's settlement and cultural evolution. A rough terrain that divides people by mountain ranges, rivers, or bodies of water leads to cultural diversity. As in the UK or Germany, it is not surprising that there are still sizable regional dialects and differences in customs today. The degree to which a central government has struggled to maintain control over the provinces is, in fact, a recurring theme in Japanese history. Fear of regional autonomy and rebellion led to the creation of strong central institutions that sought to control even the smallest aspects of people's lives. Mythology in Japan. Whether it is the Wild West, the bold and resilient revolution heroes, or the sage and dignified kings, every nation has its own nationalist baggage. Japan is no exception. The various ethnic groups that eventually made up the Japanese population are reflected in the complex, ambiguous, multifaceted, and wildly varying mythological origins of the Japanese state. According to a condensed form of Japanese folklore, heaven and earth were one, and the world was a chaotic mass like an egg. The heavier impure portion eventually became the earth, while the purer portion gradually separated into heaven. Godlike creatures appeared between heaven and earth. Eventually, something resembling a reed shoot appeared between heaven and earth and became a god. Izanagi and Izanami, also called the male who invites and the female who invites, were the most important of the 7 that came after. They pushed a jeweled spear, obviously a phallic symbol consistent with early conceptions of creation, down into the ocean while standing on the floating bridge of heaven. Water dripped from the spear as it was raised, creating an island they descended to. They eventually decided to marry, and Izanami produced islands, rivers, seas, plants, and trees. While purifying himself, by washing one eye, Izanagi gave birth to the sun goddess Amaterasu. He chose to send her up the ladder to heaven to illuminate the earth forever, because she was so incredibly beautiful. Once more, Izanagi gave birth to Tsukiyomi, the moon deity, while purifying himself. Amaterasu sent him to heaven because he didn't agree with him. They became separated by day and night as a result of her refusal to look at Tsukiyomi. The next child was Susanoo-wo, also known as the storm god, or ocean, who was violently angry and cruel. The world was plunged into darkness when Amaterasu hid herself in a cave following a terrible argument with him about his inappropriate behavior. The other gods, understandably upset by this development, brought a sacred tree and placed it outside the cave. They set a jewel and a bronze mirror in its branches. One goddess danced indecently when Amaterasu was still nowhere to be seen. The other's laughter aroused her curiosity and lured her out of the cave, where the world was once more illuminated. Susanoo-wo's involvement in this affair ultimately led to his expulsion from heaven, the world of the gods. After that, he went on a lot of adventures, one of which was killing an 8-headed serpent with a sword hidden in its tail, which he then gave to Amaterasu as a token of his repentance. What does this fragment of Japanese mythology signify, then? In contrast to other civilizations, the mythological origins are documented relatively recently in the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, and the Kojiki, Records of Ancient Matters. These dates are from AD 712 and 720, making them some of Japan's oldest records. The emperor benefited from his divine ancestry as he attempted to consolidate his power by writing these records. Indeed, there were several regional powers at the time, and the struggle between Susanoo and Amaterasu is a metaphor for the struggle between various groups vying for control. In any case, the works have many scholarly contradictions and blatant fabrications. Throughout Japanese history, myths have occasionally been used for political ends, particularly during the Meiji era of the 19th century. The years leading up to the Pacific War were the most recent instances of using mythology to unite the Japanese in a sense of nationalism. Having an emperor as the nominal head of the Japanese people is generally politically beneficial, and the myths validate his authority. Even though the counting is obviously incorrect, people assert that the current emperor is Amaterasu's 125th direct descendant. Many in Japan still consider the sword, jewel, and mirror sacred symbols, indicating their clear significance. Also dating back to the early days of civilization is the veneration of the sun. The mythology links to rituals at the winter solstice to promote the sun's return, a practice akin to Western Christmas celebrations. And one account of Japanese history claims that the country's first residents were sun worshippers. The Chinese word Ji-pen, which translates to the place where the sun comes from, may be the source of the names Nihon, Nippon, and Japan, thus the land of the rising sun. The existence of numerous gods or spirits, kami, which are central to Shinto, Japan's native religion, is also explained by the myths, the way of the gods. An animistic belief system that helped primitive people understand changes in the natural environment. This religion is essentially one of nature worship. The absence of evil and virtue is a prominent feature of Japanese mythology. Instead, gods are usually calm, hot-tempered, etc. Through these early myths, gender roles, male-female relationships, and the nature of life and death are also intricately examined. The myths give rise to a few other concepts, one of which is the island's divine origins, a notion that has been reaffirmed periodically throughout Japanese history. There are explanations for catastrophes, war, and the separation of the gods, the dead, and the present. There is also a significant female presence, similar to the beginnings of many societies, with a later shift from matriarchy to patriarchy. Some early leaders were empresses. Like any type of national identity, such ideas or belief systems are both positive and negative, so it is impossible to categorize them as either. However, in Japan's case, these notions reinforce the perception that many Japanese people are special, which is especially strong among older people, particularly those who received their education before or during the Pacific War. Arrogance and xenophobia are the drawbacks, even though this might boost the sense of pride and national identity. This phenomenon continues in various forms, especially in the writings of Nihonjinron, which peaked in the late 1980s. For instance, in the 1980s, foreign negotiators were perplexed by statements like, "Our stomachs are different from yours, so we can't digest the food you want to sell us during trade discussions." The record of archaeology. To what extent are the Japanese different? What can be learned about their origins from the archaeological record? It is thought that humans first came to Japan from Korea, China, and the Pacific Islands around 200,000 years ago, though this date is still up for debate. Some researchers even put it as early as 600,000 years ago. Before the last glaciers receded some 15,000 years ago, Japan was sporadically connected to the mainland in the north, west, and south by several parallel land bridges. The Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, foundation of the Japanese people, was formed by waves of migration to the island some 30,000 years ago, as archaeological evidence makes abundantly evident. According to modern DNA analysis, the first wave of migrants came from Southeast Asia, while later waves came from the Asian mainland. From about 10,000 to 300 BC, the Jomon, a major Neolithic, later Stone Age, hunter-gatherer civilization in Japan, flourished. Their pottery is regarded as one of the oldest in the world and is distinguished by its chord pattern. Depending on whether they were from the eastern and northern regions of the mainland, the southeastern region of Asia, or the Pacific Islands, these individuals had distinct genetic backgrounds. Naturally, some groups mixed, but others, like the Ainu, thought to have originated in eastern Siberia or northern China, stayed comparatively isolated on Hokkaido and possibly on the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin Island. The old name for Hokkaido, Ezo, was changed to Ainu during the Meiji period. They have only been officially recognized as the only native Japanese group since 1997. Even though most of the population continued hunting and gathering, several changes started during the Jomon period. Small groups of nomads started to merge into larger communities, up to 500 people, due to the development of more complex social behavior brought about by people's propensity to remain in particular places. Religious rites became increasingly intricate. Very early farming methods may have appeared around 1000 BC. In Kyushu, people harvested a type of dry rice, which subsequently spread to other areas. Approximately 2,000 shell mounds have been found by researchers on the Kanto Plain, where shellfish were a source of food. Depending on changes in the physical environment, the population during this time likely ranged from 20,000 to 10 times that amount. It took hundreds of years for the Jomon to be displaced after a group of mainland immigrants arrived in Japan by boat around 300 BC. The Yayoi period honors the new group's introduction of bronze and iron technology and is named after an excavation site in Tokyo. Their knowledge and artifacts from the period, including weapons, bells, mirrors, and mainland coins, reflect their Northeast Asian ancestry. The Yayoi period spanned roughly 300 BC to 300 AD. Wet rice agriculture, one of the first examples of bringing ideas from outside Japan, was introduced during this time and greatly impacted Japanese society, due to the comparatively high food production. It offered its residents the population grew, and new areas were subsequently settled. The social and political effects of this type of agriculture, which necessitates a high degree of social cooperation, constructing rice paddies, an irrigation system, planting and harvesting, can be conjectured upon because these people left no written records. During this time, Japanese society developed a strong sense of community. Practically speaking, it is evident that Japan's basic diet today was established by its reliance on fishing and emphasis on rice as a staple. First settling in western Kyushu, the island nearest to the mainland, the newcomers later relocated to the Kanto Plain in the northeast. They intermarried with the Jomon people to some degree, but because of the expanding population and the demand for additional land for wet rice cultivation, they mainly drove the Jumon to the outskirts of southern Kyushu, northern Honshu and Hokkaido, and the Ryukyu Islands. Some Jomon opposed the newcomers' domination and eventually came to be known as Emishi, which translates to barbarians, even though the Yayoi people and their culture spread peacefully overall. Long into the Edo period, they were regularly at odds with the central Japanese people. Therefore, the Japanese were a mix of racial, physical traits and ethnic, cultural practices groups from very early times, which contrasts with the assertion that Japanese people today are homogeneous in terms of race and ethnicity. At this point, Japan appears in Chinese records. The first known encounter was with a Japanese mission to China in AD 57. Both sides made many more visits over the following 5 centuries. Clan chiefs were already competing with one another and had contacted the Chinese to acquire trade goods, particularly new technology. The most thorough description of Japanese society during this period can be found in The History of Wei, finished by Chinese scholars in AD 297. It states that people mostly survived by farming and fishing, and that Japan was occupied by a number of autonomous tribal units led by both men and women. These units combined secular authority with a certain amount of religious authority. The Chinese particularly noted the distinct class divisions in Japanese society, likely due to the relatively permanent settlement connected to wet rice cultivation. A stable, interdependent populace would be easier for social elites to manage in such a society. Tribes frequently engaged in warlike competition, which would have made some more powerful than others. The Chinese visitors observed the intricate social hierarchy that developed within tribes where warriors' status naturally increased and a system of slavery emerged. Yamatai, a collection of roughly 30 Japanese settlements, or kingdoms, ruled by the shaman queen Himiko, who paid homage to the Chinese emperor, is also mentioned in the Chinese description. Although the archaeological evidence is conflicting, some scholars contend that Yamatai was in northern Kyushu, the eventual location of the first Japanese state, while others maintain that it is the modern Yamato, located in central eastern Japan, near Nara. The Yayoi people started burying their leaders in huge earthen mounds around 300 AD, indicating a strong hierarchical power structure akin to the one that resulted in the construction of Egypt's pyramids. Today, similar structures can be seen in Gyeongju, South Korea, demonstrating the mound's strong Korean influence. Although precise dates have not yet been agreed upon, they are referred to in Japanese as Kofun, which is given the period of Japanese history after the Yayoi, roughly AD 300 to 700, its name. Ancient Japan. Researchers have found over 10,000 of these burial mounds from this era. The carved figures, Haniwa pottery, that adorn some of the larger, more ornate pieces allude to various advancements in Japanese society. For example, the social structure was hierarchical, and the elites were wealthy enough to employ workers to build the mounds. The tombs carvings allude to a comparatively intricate religious system and advanced construction methods. The first Japanese state was the Yamato court. According to the Nieemperorki, the first Japanese emperor was Jimmu, who established the Japanese state in 660 BC. This claim is obviously false, even though it has been officially accepted. It is impossible to pinpoint exact dates, because 8th century scholars expertly combined myth and reality to support the historical line of the day. The majority of Japanese authorities concur that Suijin was the first emperor and that he passed away in AD 318, even though the Nihon Shoki lists him as emperor number 10. During this period, a clan became the dominant power in the Nara region, mostly through diplomacy and sporadic conflicts with other clans. As a result, the Yamato court was created, a political union of kingdoms based on Kofun culture. The Okimi, or Great King, was the head of this court. It took some time for this clan to transform into the imperial family, though, and it did so in the early 6th century. Japanese society is divided into 3 main groups in central or southern Honshu. The Uji, loosely translated as clan, families were bound together by loyalty and intermarriage with the main family. Polygamy was common. This trait is important because it was a major factor in the development of the culture up until the 19th century at the latest. As the ruling elites known as Uji, the artisans were grouped into communities called to bi, whose members worked in similar professions and held hereditary positions as weavers, potters, armorers, builders, and temple servants. Household enslaved people were at the bottom of the social scale. At this point, Japanese society started to change due to contact with China and Korea. From the start of the powerful Tang dynasty in AD 618, which lasted for almost 300 years, the latter's influence was especially strong. Japan's culture underwent a significant transformation due to its influence, lasting several hundred years before waning in the 8th century. Naturally, specific dates are merely estimates that serve to ground the period. According to some sources, the greatest influence on Chinese culture occurred between AD 552, the introduction of Buddhism, and AD 784, the end of the Nara period. Around the modern city of Busan, in the southeast region of Korea, Japan maintained a sizable presence in the 5th century, sometimes mistakenly referred to as a colony or proto-colony. At the time, Korea was home to a number of powerful kingdoms, but this region, known as Kaya, also had a number of smaller autonomous principalities. Because there was no central authority in the area, the Japanese could communicate often, which led to a substantial influx of Chinese and Korean ideas and trade goods, especially iron, to Japan for more than a century. Japan also contributed troops to the conflicts between Kaya and the bigger Korean kingdoms. To study Chinese society and bring back Chinese ideas to Japan, Japan sent many envoys, up to several hundred people at a time, to China during the 7th century. These envoys frequently stayed in China for years or even decades. Introducing Buddhism from China via the Korean connection was a major event for Japan. The backing of Shotoku Taishi, Crown Prince Shotoku, who ruled as regent 593-622, was the primary element that solidified Buddhism. His support may have been motivated by his admiration for Buddhism's structure over Shinto's comparatively archaic one, his respect for China, his wish to project an air of civilization, or his philosophical appreciation. Buddhism was undoubtedly favored by several succeeding emperors, highlighting that significant social transformations in Japan tended to be top-down rather than grassroots initiatives. The idea of life's impermanence, which is the basis for the near reverence for, say, cherry blossoms, was introduced by Buddhism, which also had an impact on Japanese literature and art. In practical terms, Buddhism was responsible for the strictures against eating meat and the shift from entombing the dead to cremation, which marked the end of the Kofun period, though this practice was common only among the elites at the time. This sentiment was reflected in the words of Lafcadio Hearn, an American expatriate living in Japan in the late 19th century, who spoke of the melancholy beauty. Buddhism has had a major impact on Japanese architecture, especially in the form of temples, statues, and buildings that emphasize balance and harmony, like formal gardens. As Buddhism spread from India across China, it evolved into the Mahayana, or greater vehicle, form that made its way to Japan. The fundamental distinction between this kind of Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism, also known as the lesser vehicle, practiced in places like Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka, is that the former maintains that anyone can eventually become enlightened by acting morally. The focus is on acknowledging that followers' understanding of life will vary based on their karmic level and level of effort. It emphasizes individual conduct more than the function of the Buddhist clergy. Mahayana Buddhism also acquired various Chinese traits during its travels throughout China, and by the time it reached Japan, it featured multiple deities, heaven and hell, and different interpretations of Buddhist teachings and methods for enlightenment. Numerous sects emerged due to these divergent viewpoints, and their historical effects have varied. The Japanese religion gained some structure from Buddhism. Shinto and Buddhism fit together rather easily despite early secular conflicts that reflected the influence of rival clans and other groups with vested interests. The two belief systems complemented one another because they addressed fundamentally different facets of a person's life. In fact, authorities created laws to support the philosophical operations of both religions. and it became common practice to erect Buddhist temples on the premises of Shinto shrines in later years. According to Buddhist philosophy, the various Shinto spirits, kami, are bodhisattvas, sometimes loosely translated as saints, who have attained enlightenment and have decided to stay on earth to assist others in reaching nirvana. From a structural standpoint, Buddhism was mainly concerned with moral behavior, as demonstrated by the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment, basically a set of rules to follow, and the idea of death, as demonstrated by the Japanese Buddhist festival of Bon, which is comparable to All Souls' Day. With its pantheon of deities, collectively known as Yaoyorozu no Kami, literally 8 million deities, too many to count, Shinto concentrates on daily issues, mainly preventing various spirits from getting into trouble. Based on the intimate connection between the natural world and the early communal life of the Japanese, this animistic religion implies no significant ethical code. It also addresses seasonal cycles and natural disasters. Shinto shrines are frequently found atop hills and mountains in stunning natural settings, providing spiritually or emotionally stimulating locations. The fertility festivals and phallic cults connected to Shintoism also demonstrate the connection to nature. Purification rituals are also very important because they can prevent the spread of disease, which may lead to health issues. There may be a connection here, as the daily bath is undoubtedly important to Japanese culture. As the Shinto religion's titular head, or chief priest, the emperor has held sacred status for most of Japan's history and continues conducting planting and harvesting-related ceremonies. Most people agree that Confucian concepts reached Japan in the early 5th century. It is a philosophy of social stability and moral conduct. Although it remained most powerful among the elites until the onset of feudalism, it would have flourished in a society with a well-established hierarchical social order. It hardly ever clashed with Buddhism in Japan. Confucianism strongly emphasizes the duties of respect, care, and obedience in relationships between a ruler and their subjects, father and son, husband and wife, and so forth. In exchange for obedience, the ruler must give the subject proper care. In Japan, a philosophical interpretation known as Neo-Confucianism emphasizes loyalty or obedience more than kindness or concern. In other words, loyalty to superiors and respect for them were crucial. This way of thinking has greatly impacted how Japanese society is organized, from the family to the government and the workplace. This idea is the foundation of the senpai-kohai, or senior-junior relationships, system used in Japanese businesses. Service is also highly valued by the Japanese. The concept of Confucianism permeates Japanese society in various ways and has influenced the social structure from its infancy through the feudal era and beyond. Although the Japanese emperor rarely had the same authority as his Chinese counterpart, Japanese leaders politically embraced the Chinese idea of a centralized state. The center also embraced the intricate Chinese bureaucratic structure to increase its authority. A complex system of court ranks was also borrowed by the center. Together, the two meant that, although a restricted system of entrance by examination was also employed, which was adapted from the Chinese model, one's position in the bureaucracy was frequently decided by inherited position rather than personal aptitude. Thus, the Chinese bureaucracy, which highly valued individual ability, contrasted with the Japanese bureaucracy. They adopted Chinese laws as well. These laws were initially enacted by Prince Shotoku, mainly to strengthen the imperial family's position and limit the power of the clans. In 604, he enshrined them in 17 principles that resembled an early constitution. Other themes throughout the 7th century laws highlight responsibility, obedience, and social hierarchy. As a result, by the early 8th century, Japanese society was distinguished by a highly hierarchical social structure supported by an intricate system of codified laws and regulations. The Chinese writing system was also adapted and adopted in Japan. There is no linguistic connection between the Korean and Japanese languages and Chinese, even though they may share a common ancestor in an Altaic language from central northern Eurasia. Some linguistic connection with Hungarian and Finnish is evident, perhaps due to these tribes splitting up and moving in different directions. Beginning on the island of Kyushu between 5000 and 3500 BC, the Japanese language gradually expanded. However, Chinese characters became widely accepted in the 4th or 5th century. Japan had yet to write a language before this. Adopting a writing system that was essentially distinct from the spoken language presented a significant challenge for Japanese scholars, and it took several centuries for the language to change and distance itself from the educated elites. The main issue was that the Chinese pronunciation of the Chinese character for a given item differed from the existing Japanese word for that item. As a result, many Chinese characters in Japanese now have multiple pronunciations and occasionally multiple meanings. Even so, there was still a difference between the written form of the new characters, kanji, and spoken Japanese. They resolved the issue between the 7th and 11th centuries by substituting only Japanese sounds for the Chinese meanings of roughly 100 Chinese characters. As a result, katakana and hiragana became the current phonetic Japanese alphabet. Thus, 2 phonetic alphabets, Chinese in shape but Japanese in sound, early spoken Japanese and Chinese characters, and several other foreign words make up modern Japanese. The Japanese language is a product of many different origins, just like other languages. During this time, many Chinese and Koreans settled in Japan, including craftspeople with metalworking, weaving, and writing abilities. In contrast to 20th century immigrants, the Japanese valued these skilled immigrants and progressively integrated them into society. In fact, roughly 1/3 of Japanese aristocratic families reported having Chinese or Korean ancestry in the 815 family register. The Japanese borrowed selectively from China and Korea, even though their fluency brought about significant changes. Because of the special basis on which they had to graft foreign practices, the Japanese elites partly borrowed from China and Korea to maintain their status. Because of the distance between Japan and the mainland, Chinese and Korean concepts changed over time in ways that were specifically Japanese. Both change and consolidation occurred in the middle of the 7th century. Japan's ruling Soga clan was overthrown in a coup in 645. Fujiwara no Kamatari II, 614-69, led the coup, which a prince who would later become Emperor Tenchi, 661-71, organized. This established the Fujiwara family as a significant power that lasted until the 11th century. This reinforced an earlier trend of powerful people or families, sometimes but not always, holding sway while emperors continued to serve as symbolic leaders. Known as the Taika, or Great Change, Reform of 645, Fujiwara no Kamatari implemented several political reforms in Japan based on the Chinese system of governance. One important aspect was the expansion of the central government's authority, which allowed a small group of people, roughly 400, to govern the entire nation. The elimination of private land ownership was the other significant change. Despite being phased in and never fully implemented, this policy led to the government controlling and allocating the land and farmers working for the state rather than for themselves. In addition to gaining control over land, the government also created other policies to strengthen its hold on power. They carried out the first census in 670. For the first time, they made an effort to ascertain who owned what, which inevitably strengthened social control and made the taxation system more effective. This latter system also greatly expanded the power of the government, as we all too well know today. Several traits were evident by the end of this first Japanese state. The mythology solidified the imperial family's divine status throughout the following few years. To improve taxation and control, the government recorded occupational categories and attempted to count the Japanese population, estimated at around 5 million. In general, the organized religious system supported the status quo. For the first time, Japan had a codified system of civil and criminal law statutes, Ritsuryo. But the focus was on the latter role of the government structure rather than the criminal system. Japan's highly stratified society was supported by several social conventions. The time of the Nara, 710–784. A capital city accompanied a centralized state. Constructed between 708 and 712, Nara was the first permanent capital, emulating the imperial Chinese city of Chang'an, Xi'an, with its rectangular grid layout. Its exquisite architecture and design, particularly its temples, demonstrate the era's growing sophistication, primarily influenced by China, but also included elements from distant places like India, Greece, and Italy. A wave of artistic expression from the Japanese elites focused on Buddhism and was represented in music, art, architecture, and sculpture. In 749, the enormous Buddhist statue known as the Daibutsu was finished by the Todaiji Temple in Nara. It is a striking example of religious art that draws tourists from all over Japan and the world. It is roughly 16 meters tall and weighs 560,000 kilograms. The Heian period, 784–1185, a time of thriving Japanese culture before military elites took control of the nation, and the founding of the Japanese state, which established many essential aspects of Japanese society, are connected by the Nara period. The transition from the earliest stages of a state to a relatively advanced one over a brief span of roughly 300 years is reflected in Nara, an early attempt at permanence to provide a long-lasting physical center for the new state. In general, Japan had a very conservative political structure at the time. In essence, elites could oppose change because of the nation's isolation from the continent, something they would have had to deal with if hostile groups had been present on their borders. Throughout the nation's history, this capacity to impede social change has been a recurring theme. The institutions that emerged in Japan had distinctively Japanese traits, even though China heavily influenced them. For example, unlike China's system, the Japanese system did not allow upward mobility through a civil service examination system. In Japan, positions in the civil service were largely determined by birth rather than ability, and court rank was also inherited. Indeed, through blood ties to the emperor's family, the aristocracy cemented its position during this time. The Chinese idea of the mandate of heaven, which permitted the lawful overthrow of an emperor, or occasionally an empress, through revolution if they failed to provide effective governance, was rejected by the aristocracy, further solidifying their position. With the emergence of several distinct sects, Buddhist ideas also started to influence the lives of upper-class Japanese people. The underlying beliefs started to be felt in addition to the tangible manifestations, like statues and temples. Exile gradually took the place of execution, which became much less common. Instead of burial, cremation became commonplace. As the idea of gaining merit through good deeds and enhancing one's karma gained traction, charitable giving increased dramatically. Additionally, Buddhism offered consolation and hope to those in need. For instance, Kannon emerged as a significant religious figure. The Chinese goddess of mercy, Kuan Yin, originally the Indian Avalokitesvara, is identical to this deity. Although rival groups' struggle for dominance appears to have contributed to the court's relocation away from Nara, the Buddhist clergy's increasing political influence also seems to have had an impact. At any rate, in 784, Emperor Kanmu, r. 781–806, relocated the capital to the neighboring city of Nagaoka. Because of intrigue, murder, and supposed evil spirits, Emperor Kanmu relocated the capital again in 794 to Heiankyo, also called the capital of eternal tranquility. Like Nara, Emperor Kanmu based the geometry of Heiankyo on the city of Chang'an in China. This is modern-day Kyoto, a stunning example of urban planning, which for over 1,000 years housed the Japanese court, though not necessarily political power, before moving to Tokyo in the 19th century. Heian Times, 794–1185. The Heian period is now considered to be a heyday of Japanese history. Japan's culture was thriving and evolving in distinctively Japanese ways, while China was experiencing the upheaval of dynastic change, and Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages. During this period of courtly elegance, the arts thrived in a highly ceremonial, cultivated, and artistic environment that some have described as effeminate and over-refined. Additionally, it was a period of decline during which the authority gradually dwindled. A distinctive form of government developed, predominating for most of Japan's later history. The emperor became a figurehead while powerful families ruled behind the scenes, although this had happened occasionally. The foundations for Japan's nearly 700-year-long feudal system were also laid during this time. Historians typically divide the Heian period into the early and late Heian periods. During the first century of the Heian, China continued to be the dominant influence, essentially continuing the trends from the earlier Nara period. 300 years of gradual decline during the late Heian period left the rulers vulnerable to competing forces. During the early Heian period, Emperor Kanmu, one of the most powerful monarchs Japan has ever known, ruled the nation for almost 30 years. The emperors were shown by establishing a strong central government in the Chinese style, which included moving the capital to Kyoto. Even after Emperor Kanmu left, several measures implemented during this period strengthened the center's authority. For example, the emperor set up the household treasury office, Kuro do Kokoro, in 810, working with a few close advisors to run the government. A new metropolitan police force that kept a close eye on events spread its jurisdiction to the provinces. Japan was a very unified and centralized nation by the 9th century, but that's not to say it was autocratic. Conversely, it is renowned for its humanistic and generally non-violent governance. The decision by Japanese rulers to cease sending official missions to China, which for hundreds of years had supplied a constant stream of ideas and information and influenced Japanese political and social development, was a significant date that marked the start of the late Heian. The destabilization of China and the Korean peninsula, which Japanese rulers feared could spread to Japan, was the main result of the Tang dynasty's decline. China's dynamism was also slowed down by civil unrest, so the Japanese needed to be more interested in new developments. By the end of the 10th century, official government ties had yet to be restored, but trade, religion, and art had. For about 400 years, China and the United States had no political contact. The Japanese government created uniquely Japanese institutions during this time and revised some early Chinese concepts. The era's political shifts had a significant impact. The Fujiwara family's increasing power was one of the most significant changes. For emperors too young to rule, the Fujiwaras effectively began serving as regents, sessho, urging them to abdicate before adulthood. Marriage to Fujiwara women was one of the many manipulations that resulted in the Fujiwara mothers of succeeding emperors. Despite continuous conflict with abdicated emperors, who attempted to exert control over their younger successors, the Fujiwara clan eventually replaced the imperial family as the ruling family. During the reign of Fujiwara, no Michinaga, R. 995–1027, which saw multiple emperors come and go, Fujiwara's power reached its zenith. During this time, several Fujiwara leaders also adopted the moniker of Kanpaku, or civil dictator. As a result of the emperor's dependence on reliable and competent advisors, the Fujiwara practice created a system of governance that lasted until the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Predictably, this change in power happened without creating much of a commotion. The system seems logical. The emperor was regarded as divine in official terms. Removing the emperor from actual power preserves the imperial institution because daily political involvement can diminish the leader's perceived holiness. This has supported Japan's system of separating the head of state from the government for most of its subsequent history and allowed the imperial family to survive for centuries. By the end of the millennium, the court had lost its governmental authority, according to the literature of the time. Given court intrigue and power struggles, government weakness and division are to be expected. Nobles with no position of authority would typically play games, write poetry, practice calligraphy, a true indicator of a person's level of refinement, paint, fantasize about love, and engage in other enjoyable activities. These activities may not be all that dissimilar from those of today's idle rich. The word aware, meaning the sadness of things, conveys a depressing sense of the end of a period. A prominent feature of Japanese art during that era is the aesthetic sense that life is wonderful, but ends too soon, which is supported by the Buddhist idea that life is like a dream. We are familiar with the activities of the nobility mainly because of several literary works from that era that were authored by the emperor's wives' maids. Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu circa 1003, recounts the court life of the previous century. Sei Shonagon, her contemporary, wrote Makura no Soshi, Pillow Book, which describes daily life in the capital during that era. These books demonstrate how Japan's Heian period left behind a rich legacy of artistic inventiveness, meticulous attention to detail, such as focusing on the visual presentation of food or gifts, and a respect for education that endures today. For several reasons, the Heian period ended as dynasties frequently do. One is the well-known story of power struggles between the central government and the periphery, where control over outlying regions was made more difficult by local identity traditions and Japan's rugged topography. This trend grew more intense as the central government's influence declined. The practice of periodically awarding estates from government-owned land, often tax-free, to members of aristocratic families as a reward, or possibly to drive out troublemakers from the capital, was another component. Many eventually started to identify more with their new communities than with Kyoto. A second reason was related to land, which is the fundamental unit of power and wealth. Private ownership returned as a result of land scarcity. Cultivating more land was needed because of the growing population at the time. To promote this, the government permitted newly farmed land to be tax-free for 3 generations. Aristocrats and bureaucrats running the countryside, those in charge of larger shrines and temples, and farmers, particularly clan leaders, who already owned sizable landholdings, and who, if they had business sense, purchased land from poorer peasants in these new areas, were the best positioned to benefit from this new policy due to the already high demands placed on peasants. To work in the newly created fields, they usually used either landless peasants or slave labor, such as indentured labor or criminals. To work in the fields and avoid forced labor and military service, many of the latter had left their villages when their demands became too great and negotiated with those establishing new areas. The private estate system, sometimes called the Shun system, was founded on this new territory. New regional centers of wealth and power emerged as a result of the strong incentives that private ownership gave different groups to expand their estates as much as possible. In general, there were 2 different kinds of estates. The first was owned by political center bureaucrats, or aristocrats. The second was owned by farmers who had accumulated sizable holdings over time. The latter feared that a government needing money would remove their tax-free status. They frequently ceded the official title of their lands to a local bureaucrat or aristocrat, or to a priest from a temple or shrine to protect themselves. The latter shielded them from government pressure in return for a share of the rice grown on the property. Beginning in the 8th century, the shun spread throughout Japan. By the 12th century, these estates owned approximately half of Japan's agricultural land, with the remaining half going to the government under the previous land allocation scheme. Ultimately, this new development strengthened the previous Japanese structure of relatively powerful provincial leaders and supported the decentralization of power away from the Chinese centralized state model. Early feudalism was also influenced by the loyalty and obligation system between farmers and the people they sought to protect their tax-free status from. Buddhism was another power center that thrived during the Heian period and developed a closer syncretic relationship with Shinto. Several sects accumulated significant wealth over time and built armies to defend it. In this sense, Buddhism evolved into a force that was not only religious, but also had some political and military clout, much like Christian organizations like the Knights Templar in the West. Different Buddhist sects developed with differing doctrines and leadership, the largest being Tendai and Shingon, and occasionally clashed. After military conscription was abolished in 792, a warrior class developed in the late Heian period, with members coming from various places. The guards who served as police and protected aristocratic families in urban areas, especially Kyoto, developed into warriors. The second group, the Kondei, or stalwart youths, were granted legal authority by the central government to defend their landholdings from barbarians in the borders and outlying areas. The third group continued to have ties to the Shoen people. Warriors emerged in these regions because local elites, such as provincial clan leaders, aristocrats, bureaucrats, and clergy, protected their estates from bandits and central government representatives. Over time, some families became strong regional forces by concentrating especially on honing their military skills. Together, these groups served as the foundation for the first samurai. The names of those from noble families were proud. The Taira and Minamoto were two of the most well-known warrior families of the era. The military might of these families eventually became increasingly important to the weak central government, partly to quell unruly elements in the countryside and partly to help resolve succession disputes within the imperial family. Due to ensuing disagreements over the succession to the throne, the Fujiwara clan's influence began to wane in the latter part of the 11th century. After regional clans first directly backed competing heirs to the throne, in a political dispute in 1156, the warrior families came to play a major role in running Japan. The Taira clan dominated the government by 1160, but Minamoto no Yoritomo, a rival of the Minamoto family, finally came to power after much intrigue and bloody battles on land and at sea. In what was the first official execution of political rivals in more than 3 centuries, he put many of his Taira opponents to death. It was an indication of the military's increasing power. The transition to warrior clans marked the effective beginning of feudalism, even though the seeds had been sown centuries earlier by the development of regional centers of wealth and power. The next chapter in Japan's history began at Kamakura, on the southeast edge of modern-day Tokyo, where the first military-dominated government established its headquarters. However, political power and the imperial family remained in Kyoto for 4 centuries. Feudalism in Japan. Western Japanese society has historically been dominated by feudalism, but this isn't always true. People's perceptions are often skewed by stereotypical imagery from well-known Western movies and books. They have depicted samurai with swords and winged helmets engaging in fierce combat with formidable adversaries as well as warrior heroes who may disembowel themselves in ritual suicide or seppuku when confronted with dishonor. The always popular subject of frustrated love is added to this mixture. There were many chances for displays of pride, honor, duty, and glory because of the strict social structures of the 700-year feudal era. The unforgiving were bravely faced by both men and women. In contrast to the effete Heian period, which was likely to present an image of a young man crying with his lover over a particularly touching poem, not a picture that appealed to everyone. This era is also a favorite among Japanese people. It is a time full of images of strength and power, vibrant with masculinity. Therefore, what were the main events during Japan's feudal era? What kinds of social and political structures developed, and for what reasons? What impact has this period had on modern-day Japan? This era was marked by civil war, which led to Japan's isolation from the outside world for more than 200 years. In the middle of the 19th century, Japan reluctantly made its way onto the international scene, drastically altering the 20th century. As anthropologist Ruth Benedict may have put it, the Kamakura period marks a change in Japanese society from the chrysanthemum to the sword. The era of court bureaucrats grappling with a convoluted administrative framework, while power gradually eluded them, was essentially over. It was replaced by military power, which was more focused and forceful. Additionally, the samurai were innovators. The samurai tried to reorganize Japanese society and created their own practical culture after being freed from the outdated customs of the Japanese court. The elite's culture permeated the general Japanese population, and attitudes toward commoners grew more lenient. Many elites from the mainland fled to Japan simultaneously due to the unrest in China, bringing their own unique beliefs and ideals. Continuing the previous practice of upholding the imperial family as a symbol of ultimate authority in the land, while the real power operated behind the scenes was one of the main characteristics of the government structure at this time. Minamoto no Yoritomo, who apparently greatly regarded the imperial court, found this particularly appealing. The imperial family was untouchable. In fact, obtaining appropriate legitimacy required showing the imperial family the respect they deserved. As a result, Yoritomo requested that the emperor bestow upon him the title of shogun, which is shortened from Sei Tai Shogun, barbarian suppressing supreme general, and was initially bestowed upon Sakanue no Tamuramaro in 797 for his role in putting an end to the rest of Emishi. In 1192, Yoritomo was granted the title. The Bakufu, or tent headquarters, was the name given to Yoritomo's government, reflecting its military roots. It occurred in Kamakura, a small town near modern-day Tokyo rather than Kyoto, the official capital. Since Yoritomo's power base in Izu was nearby, he probably felt safer there because it was farther from the rival Taira power in Kyoto, and he was relieved that court officials wouldn't interfere. Additionally, it shared a border with the fertile Kanto Plain, a significant revenue-generating region. In Japan, feudalism developed gradually. Although it had been developing for several hundred years, feudalism in Japan did not reach its full potential until 1185. Even before he became shogun, Yoritomo actively reinforced feudal systems and carried on fighting the Taira clan in some provinces. He asked the court for permission in 1185 to designate Jito, land stewards, under the Shugo, military governors or protectors for the provinces. While the latter was principally in charge of tax collection on behalf of the Bakufu, the former possessed political authority in the region. By doing this, Yoritomo could rule and consolidate his authority across Japan, without overhauling the Heian-era government, which would have caused significant social unrest. Yoritomo maintained his power and the tranquility in the countryside after peace returned to Japan by using this administrative system and his frequently very personal relationships with his vassals. The established system of loyalty to a leader, which had its roots in the early family clans, was expanded upon by Yoritomo. Connections, however, also depended on formal contracts in the early years of this era, in which a vassal was paid for his services. Samurai, an old word meaning to serve, referred to the mounted warriors who served the vassals, while gokunin, housemen, referred to the vassals themselves. The well-known term samurai eventually developed from this term. Since the samurai's primary responsibility was to serve their lords rather than the emperor lost significance and was reduced to a mere symbol with no actual authority. Bushido, or the way of the warrior, was the code of conduct that eventually emerged among the samurai and included aspects of Buddhism, Shinto, and Confucianism. Their lives revolved around martial arts training, and it is from this that we eventually witness the development of Japanese horseback riding, archery, and swordsmanship. In addition to effectively governing the countryside and generating income for the Bakufu, the Shugo-Jito system established an early explicit system of loyalty and financial reward when combined with the concept of vassalage. Land and the ability to retain private troops were granted to vassals. This reciprocal duty, loyalty, benevolence, which became a well-established pattern of vassalage and the defining characteristic of feudalism, was based on Confucianism. Even though there are many instances of betrayal, opportunism, double-dealing, and broken promises, this does not mean all lords or vassals were reliable. Many elements of the old administration persisted for several decades because the Shugo-Jito system was not powerful enough to replace it in the early years. The Bakufu functioned as the imperial government's military force, while the shogun, at least in theory, received his authority from the emperor. The Shoin estate system remained in place even after Yoritomo seized and redistributed numerous estates from his vanquished opponents. There were issues with the fledgling feudal system. In particular, Yoritomo was very wary of anyone questioning his authority. His extensive use of violence to manipulate others resulted from this, and he killed his brother Yoshitsune and his family. A recurring theme in Japan, as in many other nations, is the leader's desire to maintain control and their fear of other strong forces, which frequently results in brutal and violent acts, as well as measures to neutralize possible threats. Centuries later, under the Tokugawa shogun, this would reach its pinnacle, the regency of Hojo. The distinction between official authority and actual power is a recurring theme in Japanese history. By the time of the Kamakura Bakufu, the imperial family had been doing this for centuries, and Yoritomo carried on the custom. Ironically, the Hojos were descended from Yoritomo's early enemies, the Taira family, and as a result, they became regents for his successors after he died in 1199. For various reasons, Yoritomo's successors needed more strength to wield the shogunate's authority during those turbulent times. Consequently, the emperor stood for imperial authority, the shogun for official power, and the Hojo regent for actual power. Family ties made things even more difficult because Yoritomo's widow, Masako, 1156-1225, was the brother of Yoshitoki, 1162-224, the Hojo regent. Another layer of hidden power is added when people accept Masako as the true power in the Bakufu. She was well known as the Ama shogun and had converted to nunhood, Ama, following Yoritomo's passing. The success of the remarkably intricate government at this time resulted from the regent's skill and the devoted followership they enjoyed. The governing system also highlights the phenomenon known as kuromaku, or the black curtain, which refers to the unseen power brokers that function behind the scenes. This practice dates back to early Japanese history and is still in place today. Emperor Go-Toba, 1180–1239, targeted Yoshitoki in 1221 in an attempt to reclaim imperial authority, despite his dubious hold on power. The Bakufu's right to distribute land, which is essential to the reciprocity of feudalism, was the subject of this first significant challenge to her power. The feudal system was cemented when Go-Toba was exiled to the Oki Islands in the Sea of Japan due to the subsequent Jokyu War, 1221. To strengthen its power, especially in the frequently disobedient central and western provinces, the losing side confederated roughly 3,000 Shoshuin and gave them to the Bakufu's loyal vassals. Due to the conflict, the Bakufu began closely observing and controlling the imperial court. Despite continuous intrigues among the elites, the following 50 years were comparatively peaceful. The Hojo regents maintained their good rule. The first legal code of 1232, the Joi Code, was a significant development. It established land tenure regulations, penalties for different crimes, and practical guidelines for vassal behavior. Due to its well-written nature, this code was incorporated into the legal framework that remained in place until the late 1900s, when feudalism ended. But only vassals were subject to these regulations. The rest of the population was still governed by customary law or traces of the previous, more comprehensive legal system, the Taiho Code. The Shinkokinshu, new collection of poems, ancient and modern, published in 1205, is a superb example of the court poetry of the 13th century, also renowned for its beauty. It's interesting to note that Go-Toba contributed 33 poems and was a major editor for the anthology. Several natural disasters and civil unrest helped Buddhism flourish. The court system's decline made Buddhism more popular among the general populace. Its growing significance is reflected in the massive bronze statue of Amida Buddha in Kamakura, known as the Dai Butsu, which was cast in 1252. The Jodo, or Pure Land, and Nichiren sects were among the new Buddhist organizations that emerged during the Kamakura period. Refined Zen Buddhism, mostly practiced by samurai, strongly emphasized austerity and discipline, which closely matched the warrior code. At the same time, the Jodo, Pure Land, and Nichiren sects were popular with the general public because of their relative simplicity and practical qualities. This is when many social customs we associate with contemporary Japan first emerged. For instance, the bath became popular then and was frequently used to treat illnesses. The tea ceremony's inception was heavily impacted by Zen Buddhist philosophy. China also brought tea and porcelain, which led Japan to manufacture its own superior porcelain. High levels of sophistication were attained in sword-making, which became a major export to China. This was a period of great cultural development, and even though many feudal warriors had low origins and little education, they supported literature and the arts. The Mongols are also well known for their resistance during this time, having made 2 unsuccessful attempts to invade the Japanese islands in the late 1200s. Around the middle of the 13th century, China had fallen under the control of its northern tribes. In 1268, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, sent the first of 6 envoys to Japan to demand a display of submission. Mongol invasion fleets arrived off the northwest coast of Kyushu in 1274 and 1281, but the Bakufu chose to disregard the messages and/or decapitate the messengers. Despite Japanese defenses holding for almost 2 months in 1281, the Mongols arrived with a huge force of 140,000 troops and 4,400 ships. Both times, the Mongol fleets were dispersed by storms, with the second typhoon being especially bad. Invoking the alleged divinity of the Japanese islands, the Japanese referred to it as a divine wind, or kamikaze. This term would reappear in the mid-1940s with the suicide pilots during the final months of the Pacific War. Even though the Kamakura Bakufu prevented the Mongol invasions of Japan, it only survived for another 50 years. Ironically, the primary problem was the high expenses of the two battles, since there were no war booty to reimburse the loyal fighters, which led to discontent among the ranks. Defense expenditures in anticipation of a third Mongol invasion, which never happened, kept costs rising. This was made worse by the later Hojo regent's lack of leadership. Ultimately, Go-Daigo, 1288–1339, the emperor of the early 1300s, made an effort to usurp the Bakufu's position of authority and persuaded several influential families to stop supporting the government. The Ashikaga family, along with a few other influential clans, switched sides from the Bakufu to Go-Daigo at a crucial point in a battle in 1333, which ultimately resulted in the government's defeat. About 800 retainers, the last Hojo regent, and his family perished or committed suicide. It was the end of the Kamakura period. Though Go-Daigo's reign lasted less than 3 years, the emperor likely fought the Battle of 1333 to regain power. He reinstated the imperial family's ownership of all land to strengthen his position. However, the samurai's power had become too great by this point. Takauji, 1305–58, the leader of the Ashikaga family, overthrew the emperor's army in 1336 and proclaimed himself shogun in 1338. Eventually, his successors established administrative centers in the Muromachi neighborhood of Kyoto, where this era gets its name. Go-Daigo established a rival government after fleeing to the mountains close to Kyoto, which added to the unrest that characterized the following 50 years. Power became more dispersed during this period because loyalty was primarily between each regional lord and his retainers rather than to the shogunate. This shift was supported by the tax structure, which saw regional leaders retain a growing portion. Naturally, this strengthened the ability of local lords to reward followers and diminish the national government's authority. The old imperial court was especially hard hit by the central lack of revenue, and many aristocratic families gradually disappeared. There is a well-known tale of an emperor who had to sell samples of his calligraphy to pay his bills, demonstrating that even emperors were susceptible to poverty. On the other end of the social spectrum, the peasants were also growing restless. Famine and plague both occurred in the early 1400s. The peasants faced significant debt and tax burdens. For the first time, goods other than rice, like sake, were taxed, as were services like transportation. The first armed peasant revolt occurred in 1428. An attack on Kyoto in 1443 demonstrated the challenging conditions that most Japanese people faced and the Bakufu's growing vulnerability. Remember, unlike Heian serfs, peasants were typically free. They frequently banded together for protection, strengthening their ability to work together and also a factor in the uprisings. Advancement in cultural endeavors was supported by the strains of the period. Like many of his successors, Yoshimitsu, the third shogun of the Muromachi period, fervently supported the arts. The Kinkakuji, Golden Pavilion, which Yoshimitsu had constructed on his estate outside of Kyoto, is a perennial example of high art and a testament to the elite's wealth. Even though it is now a replica, this building still serves as a testament to the inventiveness of the time. The wood-built Ginkakuji, Silver Pavilion, located on the other side of the city and constructed almost a century later, is a prime example of the Muromachi period's more austere, delicate, and subdued taste. This trait is still present in modern Japanese culture. No theater, which uses abstract drama to create a sense of mystery, has developed into a sophisticated art form. Most of the 240 classical plays are from the 15th century. It is still a part of Japanese high culture. This art form was expanded to include landscape painting, the tea ceremony, flower arrangement refinements, and linked verse poetry that evoked courtly sensitivity. Additionally, they created Kyoto's famous Ryosanji, or rock garden, elevating gardening to previously unheard-of levels. The design of many gardens during this time was heavily influenced by Zen Buddhist philosophy. Japan descended into civil war when two feudal lords in Kyoto became tense in 1467. The Onin War of 1467-1477 marked the start of the Sengoku Jidai, or Age of Warring States, a century of warfare reminiscent of feudal Europe and the shogun's succession. The last shogun of this line resigned in 1573, and the Ashikaga family continued to deteriorate. Based on strong lord-vassal ties in the provinces, Japan developed into a more powerful feudal state. Power struggles within and between feudal families characterized the Sengoku period. Within the larger provinces previously ruled by the Shugo, relatively small cohesive units arose, though occasionally these new units were comparable in size to the old provinces, and the leaders of these regions went on to become the feudal lords, or daimyo, of the following 4 centuries. While some daimyo were from lower ranks, others were from older families and had succeeded in overthrowing the failing Shugo. After pledging allegiance to a particular daimyo, each samurai was granted fiefs, which granted them control over both people and land. Many of the relics of the centralized Japanese state vanished, including the old shogun system of estates. Like urban developments in medieval Europe facilitated economic activity, many daimyos constructed castles around which commercial activities flourished. These castle towns were governed by new house laws that placed vassal loyalty at the heart and stressed a personal relationship between lord and retainer. Betrayal was frequent in power struggles, and not all vassals were faithful. They strengthened the long-standing custom of a family or village having shared responsibility for its members. It's not surprising that there was a lot of fierce fighting between rival daimyos, given the loyalties within each feudal unit and the anarchic nature of the period. A new kind of regional authority emerged due to warrior monks starting to defend Buddhist monasteries and their territories. In an era when military might determine success or failure, much larger armies were formed, with foot soldiers, rather than relatively costly mounted warriors, serving as the mainstay. The economy grew significantly despite the chaos of the period. In fact, there was a strong incentive to support economic growth since survival depended on military might, which in turn depended on revenue. Output increased significantly due to double cropping, new rice varieties, and advancements in agricultural practices. They brought more land under cultivation. Markets were thriving, and a primitive money economy emerged. Trade with China and Korea and domestic trade increased, although Japanese piracy along the mainland coast also increased. Japan developed a few small industries by exporting goods like swords, copper, and sulfur. Sakai, modern-day Osaka, is notable for its development as a free city governed by merchants, independent of any particular daimyo, and the ports that grew up to handle the cargo. Even today, its strong commercial character is still apparent. Merchants banded together to form ZA to protect themselves from civil unrest and the frequently capricious taxes levied by different daimyos. These guilds developed out of economic pursuits like sake brewing and carpentry, and merchants had to pay dues to be protected from strong daimyos, temples, or shrines. The daimyo eventually gained control over the za. Japan has always had a propensity for strict government regulation of economic activity and its use for political purposes. Feudalism changed from a centralized to a regional system during the Muromachi period. Although aspects of both systems were present during this time, Japan gradually developed into a full-fledged feudal state. The time frame of Momoyama, 1573–1603, due to the conflict-filled century, also known as the Age of Warring States, Japan was divided into many, mainly small principalities, which was a terrible waste of money and lives. A divided council is inherently weak, and Oda Nobunaga, 1534–82, the first of three strong leaders, entered this situation. His contemporaries Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1542–1616, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1536–98, followed him. Each contributed unique traits and skills, resulting in Japan's unification under powerful feudal rule. These three well-known men are the subject of countless proverbs and legends. One saying illustrating their sequential roles is that Nobunaga mixed the dough, Hideyoshi baked the cake, and Ieyasu consumed it. 4. In another tale, the three men are confronted by a non-singing bird. According to reports, Nobunaga retaliated by threatening to kill the bird if it didn't sing. "I'll convince it to sing," Hideyoshi said, and Ieyasu added, "I'll wait until it sings." This vignette illustrates their impulsive, patient, and self-assured personalities. Nobunaga, a particularly capable and ambitious daimyo from central Japan, was a brilliant tactician and a ruthless adversary. In a cruel age, he was particularly merciless, killing family members, burning thousands of defeated enemies and their families alive, and butchering troublesome Buddhist priests. This period is characterized by meticulous planning, covert deals, self-interest, bold action, and massive bloodshed. His motto, "Rule the empire by force," was appropriate and pointed. Two foreign imports played a major role in Japan's development during this time: Christianity and modern weapons. In 1543, a storm blew three Portuguese traders ashore onto an island in southern Kyushu, beginning Western contact. Christianity and weapons were closely related because trade mostly occurred in areas where Christianity was legal, and the daimyo were fiercely competitive. Some accepted Christianity to secure trade, particularly weapons. Several daimyos quickly adopted muskets and started manufacturing them, and by 1575, Nobunaga was able to field musketeers with smoothbore weapons at the Battle of Okehazama, near Nagoya, where they gave him a significant advantage. Nobunaga had begun the process of uniting Japan and proceeded with several administrative reforms, such as the removal of customs duties to promote trade between various daimyo-controlled regions, the construction of additional roads, the encouragement of Christianity to balance the power of the Buddhist sects, the confiscation of weapons from the peasantry, and finally, a land survey to determine the extent of Nobunaga's domain. Despite Nobunaga's genius, he controlled less than half of Japan's provinces by 1582, with powerful daimyos still in the outer provinces. In that year, he was killed by one of his officers at the age of 49, entangling Hideyoshi in a succession dispute between other officers and Nobunaga's sons, and when he prevailed, he carried out Nobunaga's plans. Like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi had personal qualities that helped him thrive during challenging times. Rumored to be small and unattractive, Nobunaga referred to him as Monkey. He was a self-made man, the son of a peasant foot soldier who ascended through the ranks to become one of Nobunaga's most capable generals. Most significantly, Hideyoshi was regarded as a brilliant leader who could build friendships and coalitions to stop needless deaths. But he was also renowned for his ability to fight brutally when called upon. The main theme of his life story is conflict. To keep an eye on possible rivals, he maintained the custom of giving loyal supporters the fiefs of defeated enemies. The ongoing challenge of managing the local daimyo and the influential ones in the area, such as Tokugawa Ieyasu, necessitated this. By isolating dissident vassals from their initial centers of influence, Hideyoshi reduced the likelihood that they would plot against him. The term kunige, province-changing, was coined to describe the technique because it became so widespread. Several of Hideyoshi's, or Nobunaga's, methods were later employed by Tokugawa Ieyasu to strengthen his position of authority. One was to make swords available only to samurai by confiscating them. This action significantly decreased peasant rebellions. The hostage system, which Hideyoshi employed at the other extreme of the social spectrum, required regional daimyo to leave family members in his protection while they were visiting their fiefs. Additionally, he hindered social mobility by making it more difficult for people to change their occupations or residences, which made it easier to exert control over them. Until the late 19th century, his strict class system severely limited upward mobility. To reduce the possibility of rebellion, he also maintained the policy of collective responsibility. They conducted a thorough survey of the land. These actions were intensified under Ieyasu's leadership, which has had a lasting cultural impact on modern-day Japan. Japan was at peace for the first time in over a century when Hideyoshi nominally ruled over feudal Japan in 1591. Due in part to his lowly origins and the fact that he had survived Yoshiaki, the last of the Ashikaga shoguns, he never pursued the title of shogun. Rather, he adopted the titles of civil dictator, Kanpaku, and retired regent, Taiko. By consolidating his gains administratively and constructing several strategically placed castles, including the most impressive Osaka, he ruled under the emperor's authority. Hideyoshi required money to sustain his army and pay his vassals. For this reason, he directly ruled over important trading cities like Osaka and Nagasaki. In addition to controlling gold and silver mines, he promoted international trade, which brought in a sizable income. He strengthened the government's economic regulation, which had begun in the age of warring states. In the 1590s, Hideyoshi sent armies to invade China and Korea using his wealth. Historians continue to disagree about the causes of this. He might have wished to increase his authority or fulfill a vision of subduing a haughty China. Some academics said he intended to eliminate the troops of unruly daimyo. Some people think he needed more land to give to his loyal supporters. In any case, the attempt at empire ultimately failed, but the outcome was significant destruction of parts of Korea and a weakening of the Chinese government. Additionally, it strained ties between Korea and Japan, contributing to the animosity between the two nations today. Hideyoshi was concerned about the spread of Christianity, which was initially aided by Francis Xavier's Jesuits after they arrived in Japan in 1549, and then by Franciscan and Dominican friars. Although it is hard to pinpoint the exact number of converts, some estimate that there are 300,000 of them out of a population of 15 to 20 million. The percentage of Christians would be around 2% if this is fairly accurate, as opposed to less than 1% at the present time. Despite Nobunaga's blatant hostility to organized religion, Hideyoshi first embraced his policy of embracing Christianity to increase trade. But Hideyoshi viewed a religion not firmly ingrained in Japanese culture with suspicion, considering it challenging his authority. Given that Christianity was the religion of foreigners with advanced technology, he must have been worried about the possibility that proselytization would result in colonization. At the same time, missionaries built relationships with China and Europe, especially in the weapons trade, and provided a window into the outside world. Appearing to embrace Christianity was also a helpful tactic to prevent the formation of a cabal that might be against Hideyoshi, as many of his generals were Christians. Additionally, Christianity served as a helpful check on the authority of the Buddhist clergy. These advantages and disadvantages are reflected in Hideyoshi's inconsistent attitude toward Christianity, which alternates between periods of severe treatment, such as the torture and murder of Christians and friars, and times when strict new laws are issued but never carried out. Other consequences resulted from this early interaction with the West. They brought potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, and pumpkins. They planted tobacco in 1600, when the plague that plagues Japan today began. Cotton also showed up. Portuguese terms related to these foods, like pan for bread and tempura, a common dish of fried and battered seafood and vegetables, also made their way into Japanese. When one of his concubines gave birth to a son he named Hideyori, Hideyoshi became a father. Very late. He formed a council of regents with 5 members out of fear of his heir being removed. Assuming that the opposing forces within the council would prevent any member from taking over, he intended to have the council rule until Hideyori reached adulthood. However, it is not surprising that the structure Hideyoshi left in place only lasted a short time after he died in 1598, given the tradition of centuries of betrayal and scheming among leaders vying for power. Ieyasu Tokugawa defeated a coalition led by Ishida Mitsunari, another Council of Regents member who typically backed Hideyoshi's heir in a battle at Sekigahara in October 1600. The conflict didn't fully end until 1615. When Hideyori and other family members died and the Tokugawa shogunate was established in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, on a site that dominated the fertile Kanto plain, even though the battle was decisive, and Ieyasu was crowned shogun in 1603. The shogunate of Tokugawa, 1603-1868. As a descendant of Minamoto no Yoritomo, the founder of the Kamakura Bakufu, Ieyasu Tokugawa possessed the ancestry necessary to assume the title of shogun. 7. But 2 years later he abdicated, and his 26-year-old son Hidetada R. 1605-23 succeeded him. He continued to develop policies in the background and strengthen the family's position of authority. The shogun continued to rule, ostensibly at the emperor's pleasure, leaving the imperial family intact but without political influence. The emperor did not actively participate in the nation's governance. His main priorities were spiritual affairs and ceremonial rites. The policies established by Ieyasu and his successors, particularly Hidetada, and the subsequent shogun, Iemitsu, R. 1623-51, were to have a lasting impact on Japanese society. In response to a century of civil war and their precarious hold on power, the Tokugawa leaders' guiding principle was maintaining control. They enacted their policies because they were afraid of organized religion, foreigners, unruly peasants, provincial lords, and one another. At first, Ieyasu used the province-changing strategy, dividing his erstwhile rivals into fiefs with devoted followers and expelling untrustworthy daimyos from their home bases. He also established the Bukusho Hatto, or laws for military houses, which outlined several regulations for the daimyo, ranging from the requirement to report on castle repairs to the shogun's authority to authorize their unions. Fiefs were regularly inspected by government representatives, who also built a strong network of informants. Everybody was observed. The daimyo assigned their samurai a set number. The Sankin-kotai, or hostage system, remained in place and continued to control provincial daimyo. The daimyo were required to spend 4 months of the year or every 2 years in the capital, while their families were expected to stay in Edo permanently. In connection with this practice, the daimyo were also compelled to keep up a second, usually ornate residence in Edo, which frequently proved very costly, because a poor person is easier to control than one with money. Depending on their prior allegiance to Ieyasu and proximity to the Tokugawa line, daimyo were grouped. When the main family line could not supply shoguns, the Tokugawa family's shinpan, or collateral daimyo, provided them. The children of Ieyasu's opponents, tozama, or outside houses, were prohibited from holding government positions, while bakufu officials were primarily drawn from the Fudai, or house daimyo, those from families that had been Ieyasu's vassals before 1600. The Tozama group comprised roughly 90 of the 250 to 300 daimyo in the early 17th century. The developed form of government was a composite known as baku-han, or centralized feudalism. Baku is derived from the words bakufu and han, which describe the daimyo's homes or properties. To put it another way, Baku acknowledged the existence of several power centers in the nation and tried to regulate and control them. Few bureaucratic mechanisms developed at the national level because each han typically functioned as an independent entity. Instead, they developed within each han. This was further supported by the land distribution system, which saw the Tokugawa family and devoted vassals own roughly 60% of the nation's land, with Tozama houses, mostly found in Tohoku, Shikoku, and Kyushu, jointly owning roughly 40%. The well-known Shimazu clan in Satsuma, modern-day Kagoshima Prefecture, the Choshu-han, western Honshu, the Hizen-han, Nagasaki area, and the Tosa-han, Shikoku Island, were among the influential regional families with whom Ieyasu reportedly dealt very carefully, even though he killed the Tosa leaders. In general, especially in the early years of his leadership when his position was not yet secure, Ieyasu avoided committing transgressions against the Tozama that might cause long-term issues. Controlling the leaders while maintaining the current power structure with its intricate formal and informal connections network was a reasonable solution to a challenging issue because the outer regions were hard to manage. Ieyasu started the process of Japan becoming a police state, and his successors built on it after his illness-related death in 1616. The Tokugawa leadership reached ever higher regulatory heights out of fear. Travel was hampered by the requirement to obtain permits, and many road checkpoints existed. Little aspects of people's lives, such as attire, suitable presents, the food that members of different social classes could consume, and even the layout of homes were governed by the government. They imposed a cap on the maximum size of ships that could be built. They put in place a curfew. The government demolished the majority of bridges to regulate people's movement. Despite being more precisely defined, regulated, and uniformly enforced than in the past, penalties for criminal activity were frequently harsh. Even for relatively minor offenses like petty theft, torture, and execution were frequent, though severe punishments were also common in the West at this time. There was also the potential for murdering the offender's friends and family as part of mutual group responsibility. This surely plays a part in Japan's continued low crime rate and high social responsibility. According to some academics, this era was also crucial in developing the ideas of honor and tatami, translating to inner reality and outward appearance. The mutual responsibility system forced villages to preserve the appearance of harmony at all costs, even when issues were concealed. This conduct eventually developed into etiquette, a characteristic of Japanese society that avoids confrontation by never being direct or blunt. Strictly limiting social mobility was another social control tactic. The four classes of daimyo, samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, in decreasing order of importance, comprised the caste-like class structure that emerged. Movement between classes was rare, but it did happen from time to time. Additionally, there were outcast groups, such as the hinin, also known as non-people, who were outcasts by occupation and included beggars, jail guards, executioners, police informants, and road cleaners, and the ita, those who worked with dead animals and made leather goods. These organizations, known as burakumin, are still fighting for equality. Because of the Tokugawa leadership's fear, Japan largely closed itself off to the outside world. a practice known as sakoku, or national seclusion, which Korea adopted at the time. This was partly done to keep local daimyo from using international trade to consolidate their power. Japan did, in fact, have established trading networks with both Asia and the West. About 100,000 Japanese expatriates, primarily in Southeast Asia, established networks akin to those currently established by Chinese living abroad. In response to the schemes of foreign priests and Hideyoshi's early worries that Christians, particularly those from Spain and Portugal, might undermine the current power structure and possibly result in foreign control over portions of Japan, religion was the second reason for Japan's closure. Another cause for concern was the fact that a number of influential daimyos had converted to Christianity. Edicts against Christians were issued in the early 17th century. Then, in 1637, about 37,000 peasants, the majority of whom were Christians, rose up in rebellion at Shimabara, east of Nagasaki. The shogun was worried about the unifying power of Christianity, which ultimately resulted in the deaths of almost all revolt participants, even though the peasants' terrible economic situation was the main cause of the uprising. Christianity was essentially outlawed after that. The reaction to this religion was similar to the justification for Japan's closure, since anti-Tokugawa forces believed that all foreign influences were harmful and could lead to civil unrest. Isolation was the price of control. Consequently, under threat of death, Japan banned Japanese citizens from entering or leaving the country and permanently expelled foreigners. The construction of ocean-going vessels was forbidden. However, trade with Europe persisted, albeit only through yearly interactions with the Dutch in Nagasaki Harbor on Dejima Island. Compared to the one Dutch ship, much more trade continued with China, with roughly 26 ships arriving in Nagasaki annually. Additionally, there was a positive political relationship with Korea, which had no bearing on business. Therefore, even after Japan was officially closed, there was still some interaction with the outside world. The 2 centuries after Japan's closure were largely peaceful. Certain Japanese cultural traits developed, much like during earlier times of relative isolation, like the late Heian period. An even stronger focus is on loyalty, respect for authority, and group identification. Confucianism, particularly Neo-Confucianism, gained prominence as a philosophy and eventually became the official ideology of the Japanese government. There was an increase in the sense of national identity. Nonetheless, creating multiple schools to discuss different philosophies made it possible for scientific and technological ideas, like those of Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, to enter Nagasaki through international contacts. The prohibition on foreign literature was lifted in the early 18th century, provided it did not discuss Christianity. Thus, there was neither complete isolation nor cultural stagnation due to Japan's closure. Oddly enough, during this time of peace, the samurai's virtues, duty, loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice, were refined and left a legacy of admiration. The way of the warrior, or Bushido, came to be seen as a code of conduct. Loyalty to one's lord was the focal point of Neo-Confucian ethics. In a well-known tale that epitomizes the virtues of Bushido, the 47 Ronin, a masterless samurai seeks revenge on an official who killed their master. Their deeds and eventual demise are still seen by Japan as a reflection of the traditional samurai values. Early Tokugawa history was characterized by peace and significant economic growth. The financial responsibilities imposed on the daimyo to preserve their adaptability and promote economic development in the cities were partly to blame. The agricultural system, which the daimyo depended on for their wealth, was subsequently under pressure. The outcome was a notable increase in agricultural output through cutting-edge technology, better farming methods, and eventually doubling the area under cultivation. The agricultural system became much more efficient with the introduction of a money economy. which was initially required for the daimyo to turn agricultural produce into currency to support their Edo residences. Due in part to recurring famines in the countryside, and in part to the Bakufu law that only the first son could marry and have children, unless a younger son married the first daughter of a family without sons, becoming part of a different family and taking a new name. The population stayed relatively stable at around 30 million by the end of the period. The law that made buying or selling land illegal decreased land rights disputes and slowed population growth. The standard of living generally increased, mostly in urban areas due to economic growth and a comparatively small population. By the 19th century, Edo was home to over 1 million people, making it likely the biggest city in the world. With a literacy rate of roughly 30%, 45% for men and 15% for women, educational levels were arguably the highest in the world. This was due to the growth of both private and religious temple schools. The merchant class expanded as well. The Mitsubishi family was one of the samurai families who became merchants, but the upper class did not engage in trade because they disapproved of it. Because the government did not impose a high tax on commercial activities, some urban merchants made enormous fortunes by shipping, selling dry goods, brewing sake, and pawnbroking. For instance, one of the most prominent commercial enterprises in the world today is the Mitsui family, who began selling kimono cloth in Ise at the beginning of the 17th century. The Sumitomo family started mining silver and copper in the late 1600s. Additionally, some merchants, Mitsui is one example, started lending money. In fact, because the samurai continued to receive fixed incomes, they frequently turned into their creditors through this activity, and as a result, the controllers. This ultimately caused the power structure to become seriously unbalanced. The development of the so-called floating world, or pleasure quarters in the cities where men from all social classes could escape their material concerns, was a well-known outcome of the rise of the wealthy urban merchant class. Edo's Yoshiwara district was the most well-known. New forms of literature, music, theater, and art emerged in nearby regions. 8. The Tokugawa period is when the woodblock print first appeared, and the ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, which are frequently sexually explicit, are particularly well known. At this time, kabuki theater also began to flourish. Currently, all kabuki actors are men. The Bakufu forbade them from performing because the majority of the female actors were prostitutes. The emergence of female entertainers, or geisha, reflected the period's overt sexuality. The haiku short poem made the poet Matsuo Basho, 1644-94, famous. The tensions between a traditional, culturally bound leadership and a vibrant commercial class are reflected in these artistic developments. Over time, several factors caused the Tokugawa's inflexible structure to disintegrate. Some peasants prospered more than others during the 18th and 19th centuries due to the introduction of a money economy at the village level and the growth of cash crops, such as cotton, tea, sugarcane, and tobacco. Particularly headmen had a propensity to amass wealth. They began lending money to peasants who had financial difficulties over time, leading to the rise of a class known as jinushi, or usurer landlords. They could use their earnings to engage in various commercial ventures, including producing textiles and food processing, further enhancing their wealth. Inequalities at the village level were inevitably made worse by this, which finally resulted in rural conflict. In isolation, a nation finds it challenging to maintain its economic viability. 21st century proponents of globalization can make the same case for Japan under the Tokugawa era. By creating specialized goods, isolation prevents efficient production systems and wealth creation. The Sankin Kotai system compelled wealth creation and redistribution for a while, but was insufficient to maintain economic growth over time. The main cause of the Tokugawa government's eventual downfall was economic issues. Because of its focus on stability, the feudal system eventually lost its vitality and became unsustainable. Due to the severe degradation of the political and economic structures, many affluent individuals were now part of the lower classes of merchants. Because the elite's income depended on agricultural output, when agricultural output declined due to recurring riots in the countryside and sporadic famines, so did the daimyo and samurai's incomes. As a result of this income fluctuation, many samurai in particular found themselves in difficult financial situations. A growing dissatisfaction with the nation's leadership resulted from these financial issues. On the other hand, the samurai, who made up a sizable 5 to 7% of the population and worked in the oversized and extremely intricate Han bureaucracies, were generally a drain on the economy. Bureaucratic positions became hereditary as a result of lineage replacing talent. With a deficit that began in the 19th century, the Bakufu had its own economic issues: forced loans, a reduction in the number of Bakufu officials, and currency depreciation, which took place 19 times between 1819 and 1837, were all attempts to address the issues. But at its core, the inflexible political economy of the 17th century had mostly lost its relevance. In the early 19th century, political issues arose from economic ones, and the government grew increasingly ineffective. Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy sailed on this scene in 1853. He visited Japan when domestic issues were at their height, although the Russians, British, and Americans had been there before him in the 19th century. He was dispatched by President Fillmore to open ports to trade, guarantee supplies for visiting vessels, particularly whaling ships, and provide appropriate treatment for American sailors who had been shipwrecked. When steam engines started to run, they needed coal, and Japan was a handy place to refuel on the route from San Francisco to Shanghai. A closed Japan did not offer profit opportunities, and the Industrial Revolution in the West also required the development of new markets. Because of their steam propulsion and armaments, Perry's black ships caused quite a stir in Edo Bay. When Perry disobeyed the shogun and his guns and sailed straight into the bay, it brought home to the Japanese how vulnerable they were to the technologically more developed nations of the West. In Japan, there was a call to melt down temple bells for the production of guns due to the foreigners' striking power. After delivering his letter of demand, Perry sailed away, clearly anticipating a favorable response when he returned a year later. In response to the main American demands, they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. They then went on to sign commercial agreements with Russia, Britain, France, and Holland. The victory had gone to gunboat diplomacy. Naturally, Japan's response to foreign incursions was not uniform. Other groups used the slogan "Sun no Jo-ai," which means "honor the emperor, expel the barbarians," to express their opinions. More cautious but patriotic groups used the slogan "open the country to expel the barbarians," to illustrate their stance. These organizations helped to establish the Institute for Investigation of Barbarian Books in 1857 and encouraged the study of Western science, especially military technology. The necessity for the Satsuma and Choshuhan leaders to gain more knowledge about contemporary weapons was brought home by battles with the British. Various groups in Japan would either gain or lose from closer contact with the outside world, leading to a great deal of self-interest in their respective positions. Additionally, as different European nations divided up China, events in that country must have alarmed Japanese leaders, even though trade opportunities suggested the potential for increased wealth. Britain was specifically involved in the opium trade, which led to the humiliating treaties that gave Hong Kong and related territories the opium and also helped drug addiction spread throughout China. In fact, for a while, the French backed the Bakufu, while the UK backed the Satsuma and Choshu Han, who developed strong ties with the British following their battle defeats. With the Western powers' divide-and-rule strategy, Japan nearly met the same end as China. The arrival of many Western traders who tended to despise the backward Japanese added to this turbulent period. Additionally, foreigners benefited from extraterritoriality, which meant that when they broke the law, their consuls, not Japanese authorities, tried them under their own laws. This gave the impression that the Japanese were primitive and devalued the reputation of the Japanese government. The emotional response to this was the addition of Japanese nationalism, including the radical kind. Other issues were brought on by foreign trade. The Bakufu's monetary system did fairly well when used alone, but because there were not enough gold reserves to support the Japanese currency, it did not function well as part of an international trading system. This issue was exacerbated by the sharp rise in demand for imported goods, leading to a sharp inflation increase. For instance, the price of rice quadrupled between 1853 and 1869, resulting in significant hardship. Even worse, the Bakufu needed help to implement policies to address its economic issues. There was a lot of uncertainty and confusion between 1853 and 1868. As the rivalry between the different factions intensified, both foreigners and Japanese leaders were assassinated. Different Western nations supported different groups, and alliances changed. The conflict's principal were the Satsuma and Choshu clans, who had historically opposed the Tokugawas. Despite experimenting with various policies, the Bakufu was unable to deal with the changing tides. The 15th Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, 1837 to 1913, resigned and was exiled to his territory at Mito, northeast of Tokyo, due to several political ploys during this time. Like most major leaders, he put the unity of Japan before his own. The Tokugawa period and roughly 700 years of shogun rule ended after several skirmishes and open conflicts between his supporters and their adversaries. Japan was on the verge of becoming a modern nation,